Okay, so we will get started now. Welcome everyone to NWC and KKC's DOJ webinar about our latest campaign regarding the Department of Justice and their whistleblower program proposal, they are doing a 90-day sprint for making rules, and we are very interested in those rules and helping you all understand the important elements that those rules should include and why you should take action. So my name is Siri Nelson. I'm here with Stephen Kohn. To tell you a bit about Stephen and Kohn, in case you didn't know about him, which I hope you do, he has 38 years of experience with peer-reviewed rated articles by the National Law Journal, and he is one of the 50 top plaintiffs' lawyers in the United States. He is the only whistleblower rights lawyer with that distinction, very proud to say. And in March 2024, Forbes named him one of the top 200 lawyers in the United States, which also places him as the only whistleblower lawyer to receive that distinction as well. In 1988, he helped found National Whistleblower Center, and he is the chairman of our board. So we are very proud of his achievements and so grateful that he is sharing his wisdom with you all today. Stephen Kohn is the author of the first legal treatise on whistleblowing and is the world's most published author on whistleblower protection. His most recent book, which is Rules for Whistleblowers, is a wonderful publication that you should pick up. You can buy it at National Whistleblower Center's website. Anybody who donates over $50 to National Whistleblower Center can also receive the book complimentary on us. And it is also the most authoritative resource on whistleblowers and whistleblower law, whistleblowing issues, and transnational realities, which is what we'll be talking about today for a large part. Stephen Kohn is known for his successful strategies and leveraging whistleblower protection and reward laws, which we'll be talking about today. And many of these laws, Steve has also played a role in authoring. So that makes him a really good person to talk about rulemaking and understanding the important moves the agency needs to consider as they're adopting a new whistleblower program. In case you're unfamiliar with me, my name is Siri Nelson. I am the Executive Director of the National Whistleblower Center, and I work primarily to support whistleblowers and to make sure that they are protected when they expose corruption. I've worked around the world to advocate for whistleblower rights and to educate other nonprofit organizations and civil society leaders about whistleblower issues, successful whistleblower programs, and how to improve protections in their area. I previously worked as an associate attorney and policy counsel at Kohn Pinto, where Stephen Kohn currently sits. And I advocated for the passage of Anti-Money Laundering Whistleblower Protection Improvement Act, and that was unanimously passed in 2022. Since then, we've been fighting for great rules so that the anti-money laundering whistleblower program can actually be used by real whistleblowers and their attorneys to stop corruption around the world. So this DOJ program is a big part of that effort to stop corruption and to help protect our democracy and empower whistleblowers. So I'm really, really happy to be here with Stephen Kohn. We both teach whistleblower law at Northeastern University School of Law together. So we're really excited to put on our professor hats for this webinar and teach all of you a little bit about whistleblower protections and the role that the Department of Justice can play in empowering whistleblowers to come forward and protecting them when they do decide to courageously make their disclosures to the government about crime. So thank you everyone for joining. I would love to extend our gratitude to all of the participants who have joined this webinar. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded, so in the future you can share it with your friends and help educate them about the DOJ Whistleblower Program. The purpose of this session is to discuss the upcoming DOJ Whistleblower Reward Program, and this program has the potential to make a significant impact on the global fight against corruption. It will focus on asset forfeiture cases and offer incentives to whistleblowers in critical areas to combat corruption. Before I continue, Steve, is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And I say let's go on with the show.
Awesome. So as we get started, I'd like to encourage everyone to sign 2 letters. One is urging the DOJ to model a program based on a highly successful Dodd-Frank programs, which we will talk about, and follow those best practices, which include confidentiality, anti-retaliation, and rewards. And then also, if you represent a civil society organization, a nonprofit, please consider signing our organizational sign-on, which will demonstrate to the DOJ that international anti-corruption organizations and the international anti-corruption community is all together and paying attention to this program and the value that it brings for global whistleblowers. We want the potential for a global impact to be demonstrated to the Department of Justice so they can understand the importance of their decision and how they can play a role in anti-corruption strategies worldwide. So please look at the chat. We will put some links in there for taking action on these letters, signing on, and feel free to be in touch with us if you have questions after the webinar. So now let's dive into the informational piece. We also have a targeted action where you can express yourself directly to the United States government, and there will also be a link for that in the chat. So there's lots of ways to take action, but some of you might want to be a little bit more informed before taking action, and that's why we're here today talking with Steve and Kohn about this important initiative. So Steve, what do we know about the DOJ program based on what they've announced? What can we assume based on the DOJ's current legal obligations?
Sure. Well, thank you, Siri, and thank you everyone who's participating. This program that the Department of Justice is currently formulating has the potential to be one of the most important whistleblower protection and award laws passed, with equal force to laws like Dodd-Frank or even False Claims Act. Why? There's a little used statute that gives the Department of Justice the discretion to pay awards in asset forfeiture cases. And I'll talk about why those particular cases are so significant in a second. And this law has primarily been used by the Drug Enforcement Administration. They've given out last year about $12 million in drug cases. But the Department of Justice realized that this law gives them the power and legal authority to establish a Dodd-Frank False Claims Act style award law covering asset forfeitures. In other words, an entirely new whistleblower law. And when you look at the statute, it says very little. It says that the Attorney General can take money from the money seized in asset forfeiture cases and can pay awards. And what's significant is that's it. So there's nothing stopping the Attorney General from creating an award law precisely like the SEC did in Dodd-Frank. They can set up the mandatory awards at between 10 to 30%. They can adopt the very good criteria used in evaluating whether a whistleblower should be paid and at what amounts. They can establish a whistleblower office. They can establish strict confidentiality. They can pretty much set this office up. And what's interesting is when the Department of Justice announced the creation of this new program, they specifically said they were looking at Dodd-Frank and similar laws that have been incredibly successful. But then they went on and talked about other things they may do in this law that are counter to whistleblower rights, such as They don't want to, they may not want to pay any whistleblower until the victims get paid. Well, that raises so many issues because, as some of you may know, in some of these cases, the victims are large corporations. We did a case in which we won a $66 million qui tam judgment, but the victims were oil companies, and our whistleblower never got a penny from the false claims because the oil companies were victims. Hold it right there. Something's not right. So the whistleblower is the goose that lays the golden egg. If it's not for the whistleblower, there is no money for the victims. And Dodd-Frank understands that fully. In Dodd-Frank, there's no restrictions. So DOJ can follow that. There are other things they're looking at that would be counter. But on the positive side, and this is the point I want to make to everyone here, they've said they want to set up a good program. We need to hold their feet to the fire. We need to explain what a good program is. We need to explain that if they deviate from the proven procedures that work, their program will be a failure and false promises. And we have the power to do that right now through phone calls, letters, talking to people, in Congress or other contacts you may have. In 2022, Siri and I did a massive campaign to get the anti-money laundering bill through. We can duplicate that here, but we have very little time. They're committed to setting up this program in 90 days. That gives us about 45 more days to have our voices heard. So we're here to talk about the importance of this program, and I can go into a lot more detail on how this will really be an incredibly important whistleblower law. But we also need to push the advocacy.
Yeah. So in that line of thinking about the advocacy that we're talking about, we have letters that have been drafted for people to be able to easily communicate a lot of the important components we're covering today. So these letters outline our recommendations and cover 4 specific best practices that we believe the DOJ needs to implement in their whistleblower program. So let's take them one at a time to make sure that everybody on the webinar right now can understand why these components are important. So let's start with the first one. Mandatory monetary rewards of 10 to 30% of any funds collected. Why is this component important?
Well, Siri, the SEC had a discretionary award law before Dodd-Frank. Complete and total failure. Complete and total failure, as was the False Claims Act discretionary program, as was the IRS's discretionary program. What we have learned is when a federal agency doesn't have to pay whistleblowers a nickel, they don't. Even under this program that has been around for years, they've hardly paid anything. It's mostly just the DEA. But what we've seen is when there's a requirement to pay, 2 things happen. 1, the government pays, but 2, the whistleblowers, excuse me for that, are incentivized because they know if they follow the rules, they will get compensated. You need that certainty.
Yes, that is very well said. And I also want to, reinforce what you're saying, because we've spoken to so many people around the world, and I see some questions about, how do we help other countries understand these best practices? What are some steps that we can kind of encourage them to consider when they're establishing whistleblower programs? And the mandatory monetary reward aspect is very important. So,
I just want to just follow up on that for a second. So Dodd-Frank made mandatory, and it's revolutionized. I mean, it has 18,000 people last year. Billions collected. Hundreds of whistleblowers compensated. That speaks for itself.
Yes, it does.
But
And
if you
also,
can get Melissa to get me a glass of water.
I know, I think you need some water. I think you need some water. It's okay, you'll have some in a second. But while you're getting some water, I'll speak a little bit on the importance of mandatory rewards and how they impact whistleblowers. So what we've seen happen across the board is that there are programs that have some sort of rewards available for whistleblowers. However, they aren't being utilized because whistleblowers need stability. Going into the situation where you're blowing a whistle is very scary, it's very risky. So any amount of stability whistleblowers can be offered really needs to be emphasized. So when there are reward programs and they're discretionary, that can involve a long process, that can involve uncertainty. Whistleblowers are not sure if they have access to rewards. They can feel afraid that they'll be let out in the cold and not be able to continue being able to provide for themselves. So as you know, whistleblowers can suffer retaliation. They can fear loss of employment. They can fear failure to be promoted when they're due a promotion. They can be excluded from projects, all other sorts of negative consequences. And so having a guaranteed, great, very good, Steve, having a guaranteed positive outcome when they are able to provide helpful information to law enforcement is critical to the success of a program and to incentivizing whistleblowers to come forward. And we saw that with the Dodd-Frank Act, as Steve was illustrating earlier. So if you're ready to continue, Steve, you can say more about the value of rewards, or we can move to the next component that we outline in our letter.
So in 2020, Congress passed a discretionary money laundering whistleblower law. And we were able to demonstrate to Congress through empirical evidence that that law would fail. And it did fail. 2 years later, Congress unanimously made the award law mandatory, 10 to 30%. So it is very clear through empirical evidence, historical evidence, that unless you have that range, it will fail. So it's so important that everyone on this call and every advocate make sure that if a whistleblower does the right thing, puts their career or even their life on the line, follows the criteria, they will be compensated. Without that quid pro quo, there is no justice and the law will collapse. But now we need to understand what asset forfeiture covers. This will be the most effective transnational whistleblower law targeting the actual corrupt people. So if a bank is caught money laundering, you can sanction the bank. That's in the money laundering law. But often it's all the accounts in the bank of the drug cartels, of the tax evaders, of the Russian oligarchs. Their accounts need to be frozen, which can be, and seized. That is asset forfeiture. Asset forfeiture will empower and incentivize bankers, accountants, and others with knowledge of who has the dirty money. Freeze it, seize it.
Yes, absolutely. So this program will help enable law enforcement to have knowledge about the identities of wrongdoers. However, one of the best practices we advocate in our letter has also to do with identities and knowledge. We want whistleblowers to be protected by anonymity. We want their identities to be secret, unlike the identities of the criminals that they're exposing. So can you share more about the value of anonymous and confidential reporting channels and why it's so important that the DOJ writes these channels into their rules for the whistleblower program?
Sure. So now, say you're a banker in Mexico City, and you have information of a drug cartel with money in your bank, and the leaders of that cartel have bought a condo in Miami. They bought a house in San Diego for their daughter. It's just, the way it is. But this banker knows that there's $250 million in an account. So they properly report it to the bank. The bank freezes the assets. The drug cartel will not come in and contest that because they know it's dirty money. And that money moves to an asset forfeiture fund. Now, the bank may not even pay a penny in a penalty because they may do the right thing. But think of that whistleblower, the banker who turned in some really mean, evil criminals, dangerous people. You will want to exclude them from coverage? If you're going to incentivize someone to take the risk of identifying accounts of a Russian oligarch tied to Russian organized crime, they need confidentiality in the strictest way. So the confidentiality worked miraculously well in Dodd-Frank. The SEC has looked at it. Over half of their awards were paid to anonymous whistleblowers. They understood that confidentiality was the shield the whistleblower needed. We need it in this program. We need it in this program.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when you highlight the fact that the people who are coming forward are potentially living abroad, are potentially involved in organized crime, are potentially in contact with very dangerous people, it is critically important that their identities are protected and they can anonymously report. So those channels really need to be established in a clear way for everyone who can report to understand that their anonymity will be protected. And I think it's also important for the US government to highlight the success of anonymity in other programs to demonstrate that the US government can really provide that. Because I think around the world, there's doubt. There's doubt about protection of identities. There's doubt about anonymity actually being taken seriously for non-US persons in particular. And the past performance of programs like the SEC and IRS program definitely show the opposite. There's tons of anonymous whistleblowers from around the world who've successfully reported amazing crimes that have been intervened in, and criminals have been held accountable without these whistleblowers having to suffer because they've been able to maintain their secrecy, their anonymity, and protect their identities. So that's why that's so important in this program. NWC frequently gets questions about whistleblowers and their identities and their impact. And we have to proudly say that there are so many people who have blown the whistle that we'll never know about and get to live their lives in peace while knowing that they did the right thing. So,
Siri, before we move off of anonymity, so people fully understand, in Switzerland, for a banker to reveal confidential bank information is a crime. They can go to jail. Switzerland protects their secret banking system that facilitates organized crime and tax evasion. We have worked with many whistleblowers from Switzerland, and they have been protected because nobody even knows they blew the whistle. So it's so important.
yes, and one of the ways to ensure that anonymity and confidentiality are protected is by creating a designated office for these whistleblower tips and making sure that that information is controlled, centralized, and that rules are able to be enforced. So why is there a need? Why is it a need, not just a recommendation? Why is there a need for the DOJ to create an effective office that administers the asset forfeiture fund, which is where the whistleblower rewards will come from?
So again, looking at the SEC program, first off, the office publicizes the program so people know it exists and they know the procedures and rules they have to follow. Second, it provides guidance and training. Think of the Department of Justice. It's everywhere. It's in the embassies. It's the DEA. It's in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Those qualified, dedicated agents need some place they can call and say, hey, I got a whistleblower. What's the rules? What are the procedures for protecting confidentiality? Third, how are you going to pay an award if you don't have an office to adjudicate the claim? It's a false promise. You need an office to adjudicate the claims. So it's essentially common sense. I said this to the DOJ. I said, look, the SEC got 18,000 whistleblowers coming in 2023. What's justice going to do with thousands of whistleblowers coming in? How are you going to administer that? Without an office, it's total chaos, and you're going to have a lot of very frustrated, burned, upset whistleblowers. Your program will collapse.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just common sense to establish an office to administer a program. I mean, it makes perfect sense. It's completely logical to have a staff dedicated to receiving whistleblower complaints, processing their complaints, doing the investigations, proceeding with award determinations, and going into deliberations when there is some issues with the award determinations, and also ensuring that whistleblowers have the confidentiality that's being promised. So I really like that you highlight, Steve, that establishing an office is a way to keep the promises made when they establish a whistleblower program. It's only natural.
It also shows respect. It's like if you walk into a government agency and you're shuffled from one place to the other, and the 11th time you try to get some information, you realize no one even knows what they're talking about. It means there's no respect. Whistleblowers need respect. The government needs to earn the trust of the whistleblower for full cooperation. And the SEC and other agencies have shown how to do it. So DOJ, it's there in front. You can meet your 90-day deadline by simply copying the practices that work.
Yeah. And I think also we have some recommendations about improvements that can be made. So when you look at the letters, you'll catch some of those recommendations. But our final of the 4 best practices that we really emphasize in the letters, and that we really would love for you all to join us in emphasizing to the DOJ by taking action, by sending the letters, by clicking on the links in the chat, you can be a part of making this change happen. And part of what we're asking the DOJ to do is to implement the same eligibility requirements that are included in the SEC Dodd-Frank Act whistleblower program. So, Steve, explain a little bit why it's important for these eligibility requirements to be consistent.
Well, first, consistency across the board is essential. So the SEC's rules mirror the commodity exchange rules. They're extremely similar to the IRS rules for tax evasion. So if you have an outliner program with completely different rules, it's just going to cause confusion, hardship, and waste of time and resources. But much more important, the SEC's criteria has been now tested over 14 years, and it works. They have a criteria for judging whether you should go from 10% to 30%, and they have a criteria for judging whether you should be reduced. And really, there's been no challenge in all these years to that criteria. No one has said this was a bad criteria or this was a good criteria. The criteria has worked well. And it looks at, in a common sense way, your average whistleblower. And it takes into consideration what an actual whistleblower goes through when considering to blow the whistle, how they move forward. And it also makes a very big differentiation. This is important, between a whistleblower who's a simple participant, a secretary that may lick an envelope and send it off that contains a false invoice. That secretary participated in submitting the false invoice, but come on, that's ridiculous. Bankers are the key here. All the bankers in Switzerland work in systems that are illegal in the United States, hiding ownership. So if you're just a banker in a country and you're just following the rules of that country that are illegal in America, but legal in your country, you should not be disqualified. On the other hand, if you're the kingpin, the person who organized and planned the fraud itself, you should be disqualified. And that's in all the laws. I've represented whistleblowers now 38 years. I've never had a kingpin walk into my office and want to be a whistleblower. And it's obvious why. They'll get indicted, because the other provision is if you are convicted of a crime, you get nothing. So people who know they have real criminal culpability, guess what? They don't show up. So the SEC's rules really balance that. On the one hand, the kingpins are disqualified, but on the other hand, essentially the workers, the people who are in and just within that criminal enterprise, but just doing their jobs, they're okay. And what we found is those participants can be the most important sources because they actually have firsthand knowledge of how the crimes are committed. This is a very big point. But the point I just want to end with is the criteria used by the SEC works. It has not undergone any real criticisms by anybody. So why not just take something that is proven to be effective and implement it? If you're going to meet your 90-day deadline, that's what you need to do. If you want to tinker with it later on, great. But procedures are right there in front of the DOJ. It is up to us to make sure they read them and implement them.
Yeah, and I think what you're highlighting about the different aspects of who's eligible and why the SEC program works so well based on their eligibility requirements. This is like so important to understand. But there's another component about consistency that is so important for whistleblowers, which is that whistleblowers don't have time to sift through all of the rules of all of the programs that they could participate in or that they could be working with. And if there are different eligibility requirements for the largest programs, the programs that have the most transnational impact, like the SEC program and the DOJ program, once it's established, we will see whistleblowers being highly confused. We will see case outcomes that are just clearly unfair to whistleblowers because they didn't understand the eligibility requirements. And it will also put whistleblower attorneys at a disadvantage because it will slow down their ability to move forward with whistleblower cases, having to analyze the implications of different eligibility requirements. Having harmonious and consistent eligibility requirements helps more information to get to the government in a more effective and streamlined way, and also helps whistleblowers better understand what they need to do in order to be eligible. And this is really important when we're talking about people who do not speak English as their first language, who may be using a translator, and who may have other barriers to being able to understand the rules more clearly. So, following highly effective program rules, as Steve described, is important, but also making sure that there's accessibility, that there's fairness, that there's consistency. That also improves the credibility of programs and increases the likelihood that they'll be used. So these 4 points in our letters, they really encapsulate all of the main things that DOJ needs to do to actually enact a program that can be immediately used, that can be effective, and that can empower whistleblowers around the world. So is there anything else about what we talk about in our letters that you want to address, Steve, before we talk a little bit more about the policy aspect and why this action is so important to be taken for whistleblowers worldwide and for our anti-corruption initiatives that NWC and you, as our chairman, support so vigorously?
Sure. So just to summarize, The 4 points we are advocating which we have advocated to the Department of Justice already, that we've written letters on, and we're really calling for public support, are just such common sense. And it's so simple. First, the awards need to be mandatory. If you do what's right, you get at least 10% and 30. That is what will incentivize an informant, a person with really valuable information, to come forward. Then, if they're going to come forward, they need a place to come forward to, an office. And when they come to that office, they need to know their identity will be protected, because that's obviously needed. And finally, the criteria simply tells the whistleblower what they should do to maximize their award and what they shouldn't do. It lays out behaviors that really help law enforcement, such as they'll evaluate your level of cooperation. They'll evaluate whether your report was timely. That increases it. They'll also look at your level of culpability. That decreases it. They'll look at if you interfere. That decreases it. It tells the whistleblower the behaviors they're looking for that complement law enforcement. Common sense. They work in other programs. We must ensure that the Department of Justice gets this potentially invaluable program right.
Absolutely. That's such a good ending description of what we're asking for in the letters. So please have a look at the links in the chat, click through them, read the letters, fill out the forms, send your letter to Congress today to express your strong support of NWC's recommendations and the important components that are required to create an effective whistleblower program in the Department of Justice. If you still need more information about why this act is so important, really pay attention to the coming answers to these questions. So we have been fighting at NWC for the anti-money laundering program to really have some clear rules for whistleblowers to engage in. We've identified anti-money laundering efforts as a major component in fighting corruption, including intervening in global conflict, like what's happening right now with Russia and Ukraine, and the different kinds of ways money is moving in an illegal manner and supporting crimes that are happening against humanity. So whistleblowers play a very important role on the global stage, and the United States strategy against corruption, which President Biden issued like in 2022, is that right, Steve, in 2022?
December 2021, yeah.
And 2021. So this is a very long-standing strategy that is currently being implemented to fight corruption worldwide. And we see that these programs play a major role, and whistleblowers were actually noticed and mentioned in this anti-corruption strategy. So Steve, can you please share a little bit about, and especially because in your book, you go into detail about the role that whistleblowers play worldwide to fight corruption. But can you share specifically about the DOJ's role, asset forfeiture, and how it has to do with anti-money laundering, and the larger policy and human rights issue that is being addressed when we support whistleblowers who help fight corruption in this way?
Sure. So with the Dodd-Frank Act, the whistleblowers who exposed violations of foreign bribery under Foreign Corrupt Practices Act obtained protection. So for the first time, you could evaluate how a U.S. program operates internationally to help combat corruption. Asset forfeiture, because it targets potentially bad apples, bad criminals, is really going to be front and center in combating international corruption. But our program was audited and evaluated. So the OECD, a very prestigious and well-known international organization for which the United States is one of the primary members, but so are 40 other countries, our Dodd-Frank International Whistleblower Program was audited by experts from outside of the United States, looking in. And they determined that this program was a really good program. They fully endorsed it. That's telling you a lot for the role in international corruption. Following that, the evaluation of the entire US strategy on combating corruption worldwide specifically stated that the United States must stand in solidarity. That's the White House's words, solidarity with whistleblowers. And the strategy looked at the financial crime detection mechanism of the AML law as a good practice that needs to be followed. So we're looking now where this program, the predecessor on FCPA has worked. And the OECD likes the practices. The auditors like them. Let's just follow those practices as we move to asset forfeiture. So, and I've been involved representing international whistleblowers for a long time in Switzerland and other banks. And yes, the banks can be held accountable, but it's the assets of those dirty criminals that really need to be seized. And often they are much, much larger than any fines or penalties to a bank. In the Danske Bank case, Danske got sanctioned $2 billion, but DOJ found $150 billion of dirty money flowing into the United States. Where do you think that Russian oligarch money all went? Where do you think those Russian accounts all went? And it emboldened authoritarians. It emboldened the corrupt. To permit whistleblowers to start turning in those assets, we need every real estate agent in New York who knows of a Russian oligarch owning a penthouse to turn that oligarch in. That's what this program's all about. Let's dig down deep and root out corruption.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's this asset forfeiture that has a superpower, because you might not be able to find the person. You might not be able to find all of the information about where all their digital accounts may be, where every single criminal proceed they have is hidden. But asset forfeiture can be achieved when you just find some of the items. You don't have to have the full picture. You don't have to have all the information. And whistleblowers can be such a huge, huge support to fighting corruption around the world, which ultimately protects our democracy and allows people to live in peace and without fear, because these crimes are interconnected. And that's why the DOJ is taking it so seriously. It's not an innocent, victimless activity when you have, for example, an apartment in a major city that you own in order to hide money that you'll later use to do things like buy weapons, bribe people, engage in political cover-ups. All of these things are interconnected, and whistleblowers are the key to detangling the web of crime. And that is why the DOJ is taking it seriously. That is why we are taking it seriously. This is why we invite you to join us in taking it seriously and raising your voices to defend our right to peace and justice. Criminals must be on notice that their day is coming and their assets will be taken from them. Whistleblowers are the key. You are the key. We are the key.
Siri, thank you so much for that. And it's very true. And I just want to add to everyone who's participating. Are our whistleblower programs perfect? No. Are there gaps in coverage? Yes. Do qualified whistleblowers get denied awards? Yes. Is there work to be done? Absolutely yes. But it is very rare that we have an opportunity to weigh in with our experiences and insights as a program is being developed, one for which the Attorney General has total discretion They don't need to go to a congressional committee. They don't need to get a compromise in the Senate and the House. They don't need a vote. Congress said to the Department of Justice, here's the asset forfeiture fund. Use it to fight corruption, and you figure out how. This is an incredible opportunity for us to weigh in, not to be frustrated, but to take advantage of a window where we can make real progress. And we've all been around here in the National Whistleblower Center, DC, enough to know that you have to push. There's an old saying from Franklin Roosevelt. That's a great idea. Now make me do it. We need to make sure that the Justice Department does it right. Anyone on this call that doesn't think that lobbyists for the banks aren't on the other side of this, trying to figure out how to water it down, how to fight mandatory awards like they always have. You're living in a dreamland. Obviously, there are forces on the other side that want to see this not work. And those forces are very powerful. The real estate industry, the banking industry, very powerful. But that doesn't mean we can't prevail. But we only prevail if the American people and the worldwide community lets justice know they are under the microscope. We are watching their moves. We will publicly evaluate their program, and they better get it right. There's too much at stake. Now, it's a 90-day sprint. 90 days. We have about 45 days, 50 days left. I spoke with someone from Justice last week, and they told me they're trying to stick to that deadline. So that's good and bad. We may see something good quickly, but if we don't let them know what we need to make this program work, we already know the outcome. The banks will win. The banks will win.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And we have proven that your voices work. We have proven that your voices count. We passed the anti-money laundering whistleblower program improvements because of you taking action, because of the number of voices that Congress heard, because of the pressure that we exerted and the intention that we gave Congress to these actions, and how much we highlighted the threat of any failure to implement a good program. So join us in continuing to make moves, to make changes, to impact the outcomes for whistleblowers. But before we wrap up today, we really want to highlight that you can seek help if you need an attorney. You can go to NWC's website, www.whistleblowers.org, and click on the Get Help button to find an attorney and fill out a form. We will do our best to connect you with a good attorney that can help you. And we also have some resources where you can contact attorneys directly. So please, if you need help, go to that website. In addition, we want to give you a chance to have some of your questions answered. So I understand that two people on the call who have been really responsive to everyone in the chat, Kate and Melissa, they had some questions queued up. I think we have enough time for about one or two before we wrap up today. So please, Kate or Melissa, share some of the most relevant questions that you've seen in the chat, and make sure to put a link to the Find an Attorney page for those who are in the chat looking for help.
Yeah, thanks, Siri. So the first question that we have queued up is, if you could answer what the potential challenges or obstacles are to enforcing rewards across different jurisdictions, how it works with transnational whistleblower rewards programs, and just speak to that a bit.
Sure. So the scope of our anti-corruption laws are extremely broad, and very surprisingly so. Many of the largest non-US companies have been sanctioned, and sanctioned large amounts of money. Like the Danske Bank case, they're a Danish bank with no branches in America. They were sanctioned. The targeting assets is really one of the best ways to expand transnational jurisdiction, because money flows from one country to another. So the ability to target money that has come into the United States is really very significant, because we know from Donsky alone that 150 billion landed here, primarily from Russia.
We can hear somebody. Please mute yourself. Thank you. Kate, is there another question?
Yeah. So the next question that we've got is, what mechanisms or initiatives can be established to encourage other countries to adopt similar whistleblower reward programs and facilitate cross-border information sharing?
Well, again, that's a fantastic question, and we've been studying that. We have now identified about 45 countries and probably well over 100 non-US law enforcement agencies that have worked with the United States on combating corruption in their home countries under the transnational US enforced whistleblower laws. So this has really broadened the impact of these laws. And in response, the United States is now actually sharing sanctions obtained with law enforcement agencies that are non-US. I think we've calculated over $1 billion shared. So as I said, is because the transnational scope of the jurisdiction is much larger than many people understand, and it needs to be looked at case by case, but you often get it. But international law enforcement agencies are cooperating. Now, countries outside of the United States have lagged behind. There's been resistance to effective whistleblower laws in most countries. But again, in many ways, it's called a workaround. We have to deal with the practical. And as international law enforcement agencies are willing to help out, that will expand the ability to hold corrupt actors accountable worldwide.
Yes, and I want to also add to what you're saying about what's going on the governmental level, with cooperation and with sharing of sanctions and proceeds, and highlight the impact that nonprofit organizations and NGOs have when we collaborate together. So NWC will be presenting at the International Anti-Corruption Conference, which will be happening in Lithuania in June. And Steve will be there speaking about whistleblower protections and helping nonprofit organizations and civil society organizations around the world understand how they can work with their governments to incorporate some of the best practices that we have here in the United States and to collaborate with US law enforcement. So we play a very critical role in that. And that is why it's so important to support the work that we do and participate in making sure that everybody knows that we are doing this work, so that if we're ever in their area, they can attend one of our workshops or check out our website to learn about how to improve whistleblower laws in their local area. So,
and Siri, let me just follow up on that, which is important. So the trend is changing. The OECD now has a recommendation that all nations consider paying monetary awards. That's very new. The Great Britain, which has been hostile to awards for 15 years, very hostile. The head of their serious fraud office made a public statement and said, Dodd-Frank Act works. We need to start paying awards. There's been a turn, but also both the OECD intellectually, but us, the National Whistleblower Center, we know that human rights defenders and investigative journalists worldwide are this key intermediary force between a whistleblower in a corrupt society or an authoritarian regime, or a regime with no real protections. They can work with human rights defenders, with investigative journalists, provided that those folks understand how to get their information to the proper authorities, qualify for an award. So this is a worldwide program in which all anti-corruption forces can work together. But at the end of the day, If a whistleblower can obtain compensation and maintain their anonymity, that will be the most powerful forces incentivizing detection and enforcement.
Yes, that's right. And working together with nonprofit organizations and non-governmental bodies like the UN have also helped us be able to ensure that resolutions that are designed to enhance anti-corruption efforts include protections and recommendations relevant to whistleblower protections. When we were at COSP 10 in December, we saw our whistleblower resolution pass. Unfortunately, it did not include rewards, so we hope to see that improvement coming. We also are member of the IUCN, where they have adopted resolutions to include protections for environmental whistleblowers, which will be relevant here as we see that some assets are in the commodities area and could involve illegal commodities like illegal timber, illegal fish, illegal wildlife, things like that, that we are always on the lookout for. So, we're coming to the end of our conversation, and I just want to reiterate the opportunity that we're inviting everyone to participate in by submitting a letter, by signing a petition, by signing on as an organization. You can get in touch with National Whistleblower Center. You can follow us at National Whistleblower Center on LinkedIn, and you can also follow us on Instagram at National Whistleblower Center. You can follow us on Twitter at Stop Fraud, and you can find Steve Kohn on LinkedIn as well. So you can follow us. You can look at our YouTube channel. This webinar will be posted on YouTube for folks to watch. So please feel free to share it when it is posted, and also share out the links for the different letters that we are asking you to participate in. And I also want to highlight that Kohn Pinto has definitely provided significant resources to make this webinar possible. And webinars like this are not possible without significant support from firms like Kohn Pinto, but also from the public. So I ask you today to consider making a donation to NWC, because this work is only possible with your support. We can only advocate for whistleblowers with your support, with you taking action, with you making donations, and with you letting us know in every way you can that you support the work we're doing. And that includes by attending these webinars. So we really appreciate everyone who signed up, everyone who's here, everyone who engaged in chat, everyone who is going to share this link. And I just want to say thank you to you, Steve, for your great remarks today, for educating the public, and for your commitment to making sure that whistleblowers around the world can be the key to fighting corruption.
And Siri, if I just may, in closing, this is not your normal webinar where you get up and just give information and everyone's happy. And it's not like an academic approach. Yes, we've given information. We have information online. We think the information about what's needed and what's going on about the law that's at issue is all very helpful, and we have more to say on that in our letters, etc. But this webinar is about taking action. It is a 90-day sprint. We do have 45 more days. There's tremendous policies at issue. We're looking at whether whistleblowers from around the world in some of the worst areas that want to report some very bad corrupt activities, what level of protection will they have? And these people mostly, their voices are not heard. They have no way of even knowing what's going on, and how are they going to communicate anyway? It is up to us, the human rights defenders, the NGOs, the lawyers, to make sure that a legal mechanism is put into place that over the years will have massive impact, not just in combating corruption, but providing a lifeline to all of those whistleblowers worldwide that today have nothing but fear and despair. We can provide that lifeline, but it has to be real. It has to be a solid rope that they can grab onto and that they can get pulled onto the ship of progress. We need to mobilize to get that done. So this webinar is about education, but really it's about get up, take action, we can actually have major impact. But unless people act, and that's in any way you can, including donating to the National Whistleblower Center, but making calls, getting on the letters, educating yourself, call up the Attorney General, demand that whistleblowers worldwide get the protections they absolutely deserve.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be ending the webinar. Please look out on YouTube for the recording and feel free to be in touch with us at Stop Fraud on Twitter, at National Whistleblower Center on Instagram, and at our website, whistleblowers.org. You can also find Stephen Kohn on LinkedIn, and you can check out the Kohn Colapinto law firm at kkc.com. Anything else before we close?
I want to just thank everybody for taking the time, and I really hope you can help amplify the messages.